The annual Chipping Craden Spring Fair had long been a treasured event in the neighbouring parish to St. Mary Mead, with bunting strung from lamppost to lamppost, sponge cakes stacked 3 tiers high, and the Women's Guild raffle attracting as much speculation as the weather. It was the sort of gathering that gave the countryside its charm. This year, the guest of honour was a modest but well-loved figure, Miss Lavinia Pinkerton, the retired headmistress of Lancing Girls' School, and local historian, known for her lace collection, her lavender-scented gloves, and her habit of quoting the Venerable Bede at length. Miss Pinkerton was to unveil a commemorative display titled A Stitch in Time, Village Needlecraft Through the Ages. Miss Marple had travelled from St. Mary Mead to attend, not because she had any deep interest in historical bobbin lace, though she appreciated a fine point de Lankan when she saw one, but because she had once known Lavinia's sister, Mabel, who had scandalously eloped with a second footman and ended up managing a hotel in Bournemouth. Besides, it was a pleasant day, and Miss Marple had a fondness for observing people in crowds. She had just reached the village green, and was admiring the floral arrangement outside the bake tent when a small commotion drew her eye. It started with a dropped basket, then a muffled gasp, and then a curious hush fell over the cluster. Gathered near the lace display, Miss Marple moved forward unobtrusively, her steps light despite her age. A woman had fainted or near to it, and a gentleman in a tweed cap was helping her onto a bench. At the centre of it all stood Miss Lavinia Pinkerton, white-faced and trembling, her gloved hand pressed to her chest. "It's gone," she said hoarsely, "my lace handkerchief, the Antwerp one gone." The small crowd shifted uneasily. Mrs. Elkins, the vicar's wife, clucked sympathetically. "Are you certain it's missing, dear? Perhaps it was misplaced." Lavinia shook her head, colour returning slowly to her cheeks. "No, it was in the top left of the display case, mounted beneath the glass. It's vanished." Constable Derry, who had been enjoying a cherry tart at the tea tent, was quickly summoned. He examined the display with an exaggerated gravity, his moustache twitching as if to show he understood the seriousness of lace theft. "There's no sign of forced entry," he said at last. "No broken glass, no splinters. Perhaps it was removed during setup." "No one touched that case but me," said Lavinia sharply, "and I locked it myself. The keys still in my bag." "Then perhaps it fell," suggested the constable. Kneeling beside the case, he peered underneath, then around the legs. No sign of it. Miss Marple, standing near the periphery, did not speak, but she had noted something, a ripple in the edge of the red velvet lining where the handkerchief had once lain, a faint indentation, as if something had pressed it down. And, more curiously, a few fibres caught at the lower left corner of the velvet pale blue thread. Not lace. A few more murmurs rose from the crowd. Someone wondered aloud whether a child had taken it. Another suggested the scouts, who'd passed through not 10 minutes before, might have brushed the case accidentally. But Miss Marple quietly stepped back and observed the group. Lavinia Pinkerton had composed herself, but her expression remained pinched. Her fingers toyed absently with a small locket at her neck. To the left stood Mrs. Eleanor Shipley, secretary of the Women's Guild, and a known rival of Miss Pinkerton's ever since their disagreement about the appropriate floral motif for last year's commemorative plate, and just beside the jam stall loitered Mr. Horace Tulliver, the antiques dealer from the next village over, who Miss Marple recalled had once offered to purchase several items from Lavinia's lace collection for a suspiciously generous price. No one spoke of these things aloud, of course, not yet, but Miss Marple had long understood that people were never as simple as they appeared at village fairs, especially not when lace was involved. By evening, The green had been cleared. Only a few lingering traces of bunting remained, drooping in the dusk. Miss Marple had returned to St. Mary Mead with her knitting basket, 2 jars of marmalade, and a curious sense of unfinished business. She sat by her hearth and turned the events over in her mind, a single handkerchief, delicate, historical, yet not worth a fortune in resale, and stolen not from a shop or a home, but from a public, locked display. Display. Why? To embarrass Miss Pinkerton, to discredit her. Or perhaps, thought Miss Marple, someone believed the handkerchief hid something more than a fine stitch, something worth stealing, something worth lying about. She reached for her tea, took a sip, and murmured softly, "Lace can cover more than one kind of secret." By Monday morning, the village of Chipping Craden was humming not with the industrious whir of lawn-mowers, or the cheerful chatter of school-children, but with speculation. The theft at the spring fair had blossomed into a full-bloom scandal, and like all scandals in rural England, it grew not from official statements, but from whispered conversation over teacups, under greengrocer awnings, and beside privet hedges. "I always said she kept too many things under lock and key," muttered Mrs. Elkins, folding hymn sheets in the vestry, as if lace had state secrets woven into it. "She was crying," insisted young Emily Hart, the baker's daughter. "I saw her, right after the fair. Proper crying, too, not just the sniffly kind." "Miss Pinkerton," said Mr. Soames, polishing his spectacles at the post-office counter. "Never, that woman would rather lose a limb than lose her composure." Miss Marple, who had stopped in to post a letter to her nephew Raymond, made no comment, but she did notice that Mr. Soames seemed particularly agitated for a man who had never shown the slightest interest in antique textiles. "Shameful, that's what it is," grumbled the Reverend Calthorpe, overhearing the conversation from the back of the queue, "that someone could commit a theft during a community celebration. Blasphemous, even." "Well, at least it wasn't the church silver," quipped Miss Lillian Pratt, though knowing this lot, they'd pinch that too, if it were displayed next to the lemon drizzle. The humour did not sit well with everyone, particularly not with Mrs. Shipley. Eleanor Shipley, head of the Women's Guild and self-proclaimed custodian of decency and dignity, had taken it upon herself to write a statement to the local newsletter declaring the theft a disgraceful act that has brought shame upon our village's good name. "I wouldn't be surprised," she said loudly that afternoon in the greengrocers, "if this turned out to be part of a pattern, items disappearing, odd behavior, suspicious strangers." The word strangers was spoken with such deliberate weight that Miss Marple, examining the pairs nearby, had to hide a small smile. Mrs. Shipley did not elaborate, but her glance toward Mr. Horace Tulliver, who had just entered the shop, spoke volumes. Tulliver was a man with a narrow build, a fashionable cravat that always seemed too tight, and a way of walking as though he were pricing everything in sight. He tipped his hat to the shopkeeper, but offered no smile. "Afternoon, Miss Marple," he said as he passed. "Didn't expect to see you here. Thought St. Mary Mead had its own fruit." "It does," said Miss Marple pleasantly, "but not nearly so ripe with conversation." Tulliver chuckled but didn't linger. He picked up a bag of oranges and moved to the counter. The shopkeeper, Mr. Gorse, rang up the purchase with a faint tremble in his fingers. "Seems like half the village thinks I pinched that handkerchief," Tulliver muttered, loud enough for all to hear. Mrs. Shipley, who had moved to the carrots, froze. "Well," she said, without turning, "you were seen near the lace display more than once." "I deal in antiques," he said flatly. "I look at valuable things. That's rather the point." "Yes, but some people look with their eyes, Mr. Tulliver," she replied, "and others with their intentions. Miss Marple quietly took her leave. The conversation would spiral soon, likely toward accusations that Mr. Tulliver had London connections or had once been seen reading a French newspaper, both marks of questionable character in Chipping Craden. Back at home in St. Mary Mead, Miss Marple poured herself a cup of lapsang souchong, and laid out her thoughts with her usual quiet diligence. Theft was never just about the object. That was what people failed to understand. A handkerchief could be stolen for value, yes, but also for revenge, for shame, or to conceal something else entirely. And in this case, it was not just any handkerchief. It had been an Antwerp lace piece, according to Miss Pinkerton, passed down through her family since the early 19th century. It had once belonged, Lavinia claimed, to a minor courtier of Queen Charlotte's circle, though that detail had always struck Miss Marple as a bit theatrical. Still, it was the pride of her collection, and Lavinia was not a woman to flaunt things lightly. If she had put that particular piece on display, especially in a public setting, it was because she wanted it to be seen, and that made the theft all the more pointed. But Miss Marple reviewed what she had seen that day. The display case was solid, the latch secure. The theft had taken place within a narrow window, during the half hour before the pie judging and after the school choir's performance, a time when most were either milling about the food tents or watching the Morris dancers, which meant someone had known exactly when to act, someone who had a reason to want that handkerchief. Gornand, who had likely expected it, would not be missed until much later. Miss Marple's mind turned briefly to Mrs. Shipley, a known rival, and to Tulliver, of course, whose interest in antiques might not have been limited to business. And then there was Lavinia herself. Because sometimes, she thought, the person who cried thief wasn't always the victim. Sometimes they were hiding something else entirely. She finished her tea and stood slowly, her joints stiff from the afternoon's chill. Outside, the wind stirred the hedge leaves, and a single crow cawed from the church steeple. Tomorrow, she thought, would be a good day to visit Miss Pinkerton. Not as an investigator, just as a friend. Because real answers, Miss Marple had long known, rarely came from the loudest voices in the grocer's. They came in pauses, in silences, in the moments just before the teacup was lifted. Miss Lavinia Pinkerton lived in a prim whitewashed cottage at the edge of Chipping Craden, surrounded by neatly trimmed lavender bushes and a trellis that supported, in orderly fashion, 3 varieties of climbing rose. The house itself gave the appearance of meticulous control shutters, always closed at the same angle. Doormat always brushed. The milk bottles rotated precisely so the dates faced outward. It was not a house where things were misplaced. Miss Marple arrived just before 11, greeted at the gate by the soft clatter of a wind chime and a mild bark from a terrier inside. Lavinia answered the door herself, wearing a slate-blue cardigan and a chain of pearls that sat, as always, exactly centered at her collarbone. "Jane," she said, a note of surprise in her voice. "How lovely! Do come in." The sitting-room was exactly as Miss Marple had remembered its stiff chairs with antimacassars, a faded rug with symmetrical fraymarks, and one of those bone china tea-sets that were beautiful but never quite inviting. "I hope I'm not intruding," Miss Marple said, as she accepted a seat by the window. "Not at all," said Lavinia. "It's a comfort, really, to have a sensible face about. I've been positively besieged by suggestions. Mrs. Shipley has already decided I staged the theft for attention, and Mr. Tulliver had the gall to ask whether I'd insured the item properly." She sniffed. "As if I'd do such a thing. And have you?" Miss Marple asked mildly. Lavinia gave her a sharp look, then sighed. "Only informally." My solicitor has a record of the most valuable pieces. Yes. But the Antwerp handkerchief was never appraised. It was sentimental, not commercial. It belonged to my great-aunt Rosalind, you know. Miss Marple nodded. She was the one who taught you to stitch, I recall. That's right, said Lavinia, pleased. She always said the smallest stitches held the greatest strength. There was a pause as the tea was poured. Lavinia's hands, usually steady, trembled slightly as she passed the cup. I'm not mad, Jane, she said quietly. That piece was in the display case. I saw it, I mounted it myself that morning. It was the centerpiece. Everyone expected to see it. Indeed, said Miss Marple. And you locked the case. Immediately after setting the arrangement, I tested the latch twice. Miss Marple took a sip of tea and glanced toward the bookshelf, where a small brass key sat on a lace doily. And the key remained with you. In my handbag, Lavinia said. I only opened the case again when the Morris dancers finished, because little Florence Elkins wanted to see the lace close-up. That's when I discovered it was gone. Miss Marple nodded thoughtfully. No one else had access to the bag. Lavinia hesitated. It was beside my chair during the fair. On the ground, mind you. I didn't leave it unattended long. Just to fetch a sherry trifle from the refreshment tent. Miss Marple said nothing but noted the admission carefully. And you're quite certain the handkerchief couldn't have shifted, fallen behind the display? No, the velvet lining was glued in place. It's not a matter of it slipping, it was removed. Intentionally. Miss Marple tilted her head. May I ask a delicate question, Lavinia? Her hostess looked wary. If you must, have you recently lent or shown the handkerchief to anyone? Perhaps someone from outside the village? Lavinia blinked. No, certainly not. Why would I? Only that someone who knew its valuer, its history, might have wished to remove it quietly, or prevent others from seeing it. Lavinia's eyes narrowed. Are you suggesting that someone might have recognized it? That it isn't what I thought it was? I'm not suggesting anything, Miss Marple said gently. Only asking what others might think if the piece turned out to have a different origin. Lavinia went very still. That handkerchief has been in my family since 1812, of course, said Miss Marple, but a small crease had formed between Lavinia's eyebrows. The expression of someone who had considered, if only for a moment, that they might be wrong. After tea, Miss Marple excused herself and made her way along the high street. She passed Mr. Tolliver's antique shop, a narrow-fronted place with a collection of mismatched porcelain behind smudged glass, and stopped when she saw something in the window. A handkerchief, not lace, but linen, folded into a triangle and displayed with a tarnished brooch. The sign beneath read, Continental Keepsakes, recently acquired. Inside, Tolliver was rearranging a row of picture frames. Ah, Miss Marple, he said, dusting his hands. Come to inspect the evidence. I was passing by, she said, mildly. An interesting piece in the window. German linen, he said. Nothing like Miss Pinkerton's frippery. That woman wouldn't know real lace if it bit her. She's rather proud of her collection, Miss Marple observed. Tolliver made a face. Pride's a poor substitute for authenticity. One offered to buy some of it last year, suggested a modest valuation. She refused. Of course, claimed it was all documented. Family heirlooms, court connections, and such. I've seen better examples in pawnshops. Miss Marple studied him carefully. So, you suspect the Antwerp handkerchief wasn't genuine? He raised a brow. Oh, I don't suspect, Miss Marple. I know. That stitchwork, machine-made edging, Belgian style, probably late 19th century, tops. And certainly not courtish. Miss Marple thanked him politely and left. But as she walked back toward the church lane, her thoughts stirred. If the handkerchief was not authentic, if it had been misrepresented, perhaps innocently, perhaps not, then its value lay not in what it was, but in what it had been claimed to be, which raised a troubling new possibility. Someone might not have stolen it for greed or for spite, but to stop the truth from being discovered. By Tuesday afternoon, the whispers in Chipping Craden had coalesced into something close to certainty. "It was Mr. Tulliver," declared Mrs. Elkins, her arms folded across her apron, as she sorted him books in the church porch. "No doubt about it, he's had his eye on Lavinia's lace collection for years. Did you see the way he walked round that display case?" chimed in Miss Lillian Pratt. Like a fox sniffing round a henhouse. Reverend Calthorpe, though more reserved in judgment, had still included a veiled reference to worldly temptation and the dangers of unchecked covetousness in his morning prayers. Constable Derry, clearly under pressure from the vicarage and the Women's Guild, had visited Tulliver's shop again that morning. No charges had been made, but it was enough to send the man into a cold fury. "He's threatening to sue for defamation," said Mrs. Shipley, with a satisfied little purse of the lips, which, as everyone knows, is exactly what guilty people do. Miss Marple said nothing. She had spent the morning quietly observing the reactions of the villagers, those who were quick to judge, those who avoided the topic altogether, and those fewer in number who seemed genuinely troubled. Suspicion had settled neatly, almost too neatly, on Mr. Tulliver. He was, after all, the outsider, the man with professional interest in the very item that had vanished, and the sort who could ruffle feathers with only a raised eyebrow. But Miss Marple knew better than to mistake convenient blame for truth. She had encountered many such suspects over the years, individuals whose manner or background placed them at the top of everyone's list simply because they didn't belong in the fabric of the village. And when that happened, it often meant that the real culprit was hidden within. That afternoon, Miss Marple visited the churchyard under the pretense of inspecting the flower beds. She brought with her a small pair of shears and an old biscuit tin filled with bulbs. As she worked quietly, she kept one eye on the path, waiting. It wasn't long before Eleanor Shipley appeared. She moved briskly, as always, her gloves tucked neatly into her handbag and her hat pinned with almost military precision. Miss Marple rose with a cheerful greeting. "How lovely to see you, Eleanor. I don't suppose you have a moment?" Mrs. Shipley hesitated. "Well, of course, what is it?" "I've just come from the vicarage. He mentioned that you were the last person to assist with setting up the lace exhibit before the fair opened." Mrs. Shipley stiffened ever so slightly. "I heartily assisted. I was simply arranging the raffle table beside it." Miss Pinkerton was quite territorial about her display. "Oh, quite," said Miss Marple with a smile. "Still, it was you who brought the extra velvet lining, was it not?" Mrs. Shipley blinked. "How did you know that?" "I happened to overhear you mention it to Mrs. Elkins," Miss Marple lied gently. "You said the red velvet you supplied was a perfect match for the lace." "Well, yes. The Guild had some in storage from last year's Christmas concert. Lavinia fabric wasn't wide enough to cover the full display. I'm sure she was very grateful." Mrs. Shipley gave a thin smile. "I wouldn't say that." She made some rather cutting remarks about the creases. Miss Marple allowed the silence to hang. Then, as if passing thought, she added, "Did you handle the display case latch at all?" "No, I might have checked that it closed properly after she arranged everything. The children were running about, and someone had knocked the raffle box. I simply ensured it was secure." "Of course," said Miss Marple, her voice light. "We all know how icily things can be jostled." Mrs. Shipley nodded briskly, gave a glance at her wristwatch, and offered a polite farewell. Miss Marple watched her retreat down the path. A few inconsistencies had begun to emerge. First, Lavinia had claimed no one touched the case after it was locked. Now Mrs. Shipley had admitted to at least checking it, and that raised a question Miss Marple had been circling for days. What if the handkerchief hadn't been taken during the fair at all? What if it had never been there to begin with? That evening, she invited Constable Derry to tea. He arrived looking flustered, with his notebook barely tucked into his coat pocket. "Miss Marple," he said, accepting a slice of seed cake with gratitude, "I don't mind admitting I'm in over my head. Everyone's pointing at Tolliver, and he's threatening legal action. Mrs. Pinkerton keeps phoning to demand results, and I've no actual proof of anything." "Proof is a difficult thing in matters like these," said Miss Marple, "but patterns of behavior, those are far more telling." Derry looked puzzled. "Behavior? You've spoken to the people at the fair?" "Yes, of course. Everyone near the lace display, including Mrs. Elkins, Mr. Gorse, young Emily, Hart, Emily." Miss Marple poured another cup of tea. "She was quite near the display case, I believe, according to several people, yes." "Why?" Miss Marple's tone was mild. "Only that she told Mrs. Elkins she saw Miss Pinkerton crying after the event. Yes, she mentioned that. Seemed upset about it. And yet, Miss Marple said, Miss Pinkerton told me herself she didn't notice the handkerchief was missing until after she reopened the case for little Emily." Constable Derry blinked. "That doesn't quite fit." "No," said Miss Marple, "it doesn't, does it?" She leaned back in her chair. "We must ask ourselves what Miss Pinkerton really saw in that case and whether someone else saw something altogether different. It was raining gently on Wednesday morning, the sort of persistent drizzle that softened the outlines of chimneys and hedgerows alike. In St. Mary Mead, Miss Marple took her breakfast with a knitted shawl around her shoulders and the Daily Sketch folded beside her. She had already read the local columns twice. Nothing new on the theft, of course, but she never trusted only what people told to the papers. What they left out was often far more revealing. She had just poured herself a second cup of tea when a knock came at the door. It was Emily Hart, the baker's daughter, standing small and damp on the front step with a tin of scones and a worried expression. "Mum said I should bring these by." "Miss Marple," she said, glancing up, "they're warm still." "How thoughtful," Miss Marple replied, ushering the girl in. "And how are you, Emily? I hear you've had quite a dramatic few days." Emily flushed. "It wasn't me who did anything. No, of course not. But I expect it must have been rather exciting to be near the display just before Miss Pinkerton made her discovery." Emily shifted her weight from one foot to the other. "I was just looking, that's all. The glass was shiny and everything looked nice. I understand you saw Miss Pinkerton crying." "Only for a moment," Emily said. "I turned round and she was sitting on the bench behind the booth, dabbing her eyes with a little square of fabric. I thought she'd dropped something." "A lace handkerchief?" Miss Marple asked lightly. "No, it wasn't lace. It was just ... cloth. Bluish, sort of rough, like my school uniform, but older." Miss Marple's eyes narrowed slightly. "Not the Antwerp lace?" "Oh no," Emily said, quickly, "that was still in the case when I looked. The display was all perfect. But then I went for lemonade and came back and people were shouting." "Thank you, Emily," said Miss Marple, smiling. "You've helped me a great deal." She sent the girl off with a sweet and a promise to return the tin, then turned immediately toward her sitting-room cabinet. Within its lower drawer, beneath the orderly layers of stationery and receipts, was a battered brown notebook where she recorded her oddities, details from village life that might someday prove useful. She wrote quickly. Emily's observation, blue cloth handkerchief, not lace, possibly mistaken by Miss P in confusion. Was the real lace handkerchief ever in the display? That was the question, wasn't it? If the real handkerchief had been swapped before the fair began, Lavinia may have placed a substitute in the case without noticing. Or worse perhaps, she knew the real piece was missing, but pretended otherwise to save face. But then, what had she been crying about? Was it grief for a lost heirloom, or something closer to guilt? That afternoon, Miss Marple took a stroll through the muddy lane to the vicarage, where Reverend Calthorpe's wife, Margaret, was trimming her forsythia with the determination of a woman trying not to gossip. "I've been meaning to speak with you, Jane," she said, ushering Miss Marple beneath the porch. "About Eleanor Shipley. She came here yesterday to leave some paperwork, and well, I couldn't help noticing she was carrying a sewing basket." "Odd," said Miss Marple. "She usually keeps hers at the Women's Guildhall." "Exactly, and when she bent down to fetch her umbrella, I caught sight of a small bundle wrapped in blue cotton. Looked like some sort of old textile. Rather delicate." Miss Marple kept her voice light. "Did she say anything about it?" "Nothing. Just smiled and rushed off, but I did think it strange. She's been rather determined to keep the attention on Mr. Tolliver, hasn't she?" "Yes," said Miss Marple. "And very quick to denounce Lavinia as well." She stood slowly. "Thank you, Margaret. That's most enlightening." As she walked home, the pieces began to thread together. Blue cloth, a bundle in a sewing basket. Eleanor Shipley had both access and motive after all. Hadn't she arranged the table beside the lace display? And hadn't she provided the velvet lining herself? Perhaps the handkerchief hadn't vanished at the fair at all. Perhaps it had never been there, and if Lavinia hadn't noticed, or worse, had pretended not to notice, then both women might be hiding very different truths. One to avoid disgrace, the other, perhaps, to exploit it. That evening, Miss Marple stood before her own display cabinet, a far simpler one than Miss Pinkerton's, with its china teacups and miniature figurines arranged with quiet precision. Her eyes settled on a single object, a small handkerchief of lace-trimmed lawn. Pale and carefully folded, it had once belonged to her mother. Not valuable in any financial sense, but irreplaceable nonetheless. She imagined what it would mean to discover it gone, not sold, not gifted, but taken. And what might drive someone to pretend it was still there? Pride, perhaps, or fear, or something darker. She turned toward the window, as a gust of wind shook the glass. The lace wasn't the key, but the lie about the lace. That was beginning to unravel. It was the sort of grey morning that turned the village lanes slick, and made the shopkeepers sigh more than usual. But Miss Marple, wrapped in her thickest shawl and carrying a handbag that could have held half a library, moved through Chipping Craden with serene determination. She began at the Women's Guildhall. It was empty save for Mrs. Shipley, who was reorganizing a cupboard with her usual righteous energy. Boxes of embroidery floss and table linens were stacked neatly along the shelves. But one corner of the cupboard was oddly disheveled. "Jane," said Mrs. Shipley, blinking in surprise, "you've caught me mid-inventory. Though I don't suppose you've come to borrow doilies." "Not today," Miss Marple replied, "but I did wonder if you had a moment." Mrs. Shipley hesitated but gestured toward the folding chairs. "Of course. Something on your mind?" Miss Marple sat with her gloved hands folded neatly in her lap. "I was thinking of the velvet lining you provided for Miss Pinkerton's lace display." Mrs. Shipley's expression didn't change, but her hands moved a little too quickly, rearranging a stack of crocheted pot-holders. Double quotes. Yes, what of it? Must have been difficult to match precisely. Miss Pinkerton was quite particular, as I recall. I do pride myself on precision, said Mrs. Shipley crisply. We had several bolts of fabric in storage. One of them was nearly identical in color to what she'd used before. I cut a square myself. How clever, said Miss Marple. And quite convenient, really having access to the cabinet before the fair began. I was merely helping with the setup, Mrs. Shipley said. You were also seen with your sewing basket at the with a bundle wrapped in blue cloth. There was a pause. A moment too long. Old linens, Mrs. Shipley said finally. Donations. Nothing to do with the fair. Miss Marple gave a small, kindly smile. Of course, but as she stood to leave, she cast a final glance at the cupboard. A single strand of blue cotton thread lay snagged on the lower shelf. She said nothing, but her eyes missed nothing either. Next. She made her way to Miss Pinkerton's cottage. Lavinia looked pale and drawn as she opened the door, her hands covered in gardening gloves and a faint smudge of soil on her sleeve. I'm sorry, she said, I haven't much energy for visitors this morning. I won't stay long, said Miss Marple. I just had a question. Lavinia motioned her inside. I've been thinking, Miss Marple said gently, about that moment when you discovered the handkerchief was gone. Do you remember precisely when you last saw it in the case? Lavinia hesitated. I told you, before the fair opened, I set the display myself. But were you certain the Antwerp lace was in place, or could it have been another? Lavinia stiffened. Are you suggesting I confused it with something else? Not at all, but sometimes, when something is stolen, we prefer to believe it happened later, because the alternative means we missed something much earlier. Something we don't want to admit. Lavinia turned away, then slowly removed her gloves. I thought it looked strange, she said finally. The edging wasn't quite right, but I convinced myself it was just the lighting, or the mounting. I didn't want to, she paused. I didn't want to admit the possibility that it had already been taken, or swapped, Miss Marple said softly. Lavinia's voice dropped to a whisper. It was my aunt's, my one real inheritance. If I'd lost it weeks ago, even what would that say about me? About my stewardship of her things? Only that you're human, Miss Marple said gently. Lavinia sat down heavily in the armchair. Do you think it was Mrs. Shipley? I think she's very precise, but there are still threads to follow. She rose, brushing her skirt smooth. Tell me, did you ever show the handkerchief to anyone recently, or mention it outside the village? Lavinia looked up, startled. Only once, to my niece, Evelyn. She was visiting from London in January. She's terribly interested in textile history. I mentioned the Antwerp piece, and she became rather excited. Did she see it? No, Lavinia said. It was packed away at the time. But she asked several questions about provenance. The stitching, I thought nothing of it. Miss Marple's eyes narrowed slightly. And has Evelyn been in touch since the fair? No, Lavinia admitted. Not a word. Miss Marple thanked her kindly and took her leave. Outside, the rain had let up, and the road glistened as the clouds began to break. Back in St. Mary Mead, Miss Marple reviewed her notes with steady clarity. 3 possibilities now stood before her. Mrs. Shipley, with motive, access, and a suspicious familiarity with the velvet lining. Miss Pinkerton herself, fearful of disgrace, who may have noticed the handkerchief missing long ago and staged the theft to hide her lapse. And now, Evelyn, the niece. A quiet presence outside the village. Someone with interest, perhaps financial desperation, and the knowledge of where the piece might be found. Miss Marple tapped the edge of her notebook. but only one of them had likely touched the case and had a reason to substitute the real handkerchief for a similar one and to make the switch untraceable. The question remained, was it to hide something or to expose someone else? The post arrived late on Thursday, as it often did when the rain muddied the lane between Much Benham and Chipping Craden. Miss Marple found the envelope nestled between a gardening catalogue and a circular from the Women's Institute. It bore a London postmark and was addressed in neat, formal handwriting, Miss Jane Marple, Danemead Cottage, St. Mary Medinside, was a single folded page. Dear Miss Marple, I understand you've been asking about the lace handkerchief. I don't wish to cause trouble for my aunt, but I feel you ought to know the truth. I did see the handkerchief in January, and it wasn't the Antwerp piece she described. I didn't say anything at the time, but I believed it to be a later copy. Please don't tell her, I wrote. She's very proud, and I wouldn't want to upset her. Yours sincerely, Evelyn Arfana. Miss Marple read the letter twice. The lines were direct, honest, and almost painfully restrained. A young woman afraid of embarrassing her aunt or, perhaps, of stirring something that had long been dormant. But more than that, it confirmed a vital point. Lavinia's prized handkerchief, the one she had put on display, was not the original. It never had been, which meant it hadn't been stolen, at least not from the fair. It had been missing for months, perhaps years. The theft, then, was a staged event. Whether deliberate or accidental was still unclear. But someone had used the ferret's busyness, its distractions, as a stage to create drama, suspicion, and perhaps to direct blame. Miss Marple rose from her writing desk and crossed to the mantelpiece, where she kept a small vase of dried lavender and a photograph of her late sister-in-law. I think, she said softly, it's time to turn the story inside out. That afternoon, Miss Marple returned to Chipping Craden under the guise of visiting the parish library, though her true destination was the back room of the antique shop, run by Horace Tulliver. She found him frowning at a parcel wrapped in oilskin. "You're not here to accuse me again, are you?" he said sourly. "Not at all," said Miss Marple, stepping carefully between two mismatched end tables. "In fact, I'm here to ask for your expertise." That softened him a little. "Go on." She removed from her handbag a folded cloth handkerchief, plain linen with frayed edges and a barely visible watermark. "I found this in the Women's Guild storeroom," she said. "I believe it was meant to replace something else. I'd like your opinion on the weave." Tulliver unfolded it with the care of someone trained to spot value hidden beneath dust and age. He held it to the light. "Belgian made," he said, "but not Antwerp mass-produced, probably late 1800s, a decent copy of the style, but no true value." "Where did you say you found it?" "In a sewing basket that belonged to Mrs. Shipley." Tulliver raised a brow. "Oh ho!" Miss Marple simply smiled. "You see, the lace display wasn't stolen, it was switched. Quietly, likely before the fair ever opened. The real handkerchief was removed well before the crowd gathered." Tulliver gave a low whistle. "And no one noticed?" "No," said Miss Marple, "but someone wanted it noticed, just not at once." She thanked him and left the shop, her mind already working through the timeline. Someone had taken the real handkerchief earlier, perhaps from Lavinia's home itself. Then, before the fair, a copy was inserted. Close enough to fool Lavinia, not enough to fool Evelyn. And then, neither by accident or design, it was declared missing at the fair. Who benefited? Certainly not Lavinia, not Mr. Tulliver, but someone who wanted Lavinia's credibility shaken. Someone like Eleanor Shipley or Miss Marple. Paused. Was it someone with an even subtler goal? The next day, Miss Marple attended the Women's Guild meeting, bringing scones and a thimble. As usual, The others made polite conversation, but she could sense the tension beneath it. Too many people speaking carefully, avoiding certain names, avoiding Lavinia's name. Midway through the meeting, Miss Marple casually mentioned a rumor she'd heard that the handkerchief had been a forgery all along. Forged, gasped Mrs. Elkins. Surely not. I thought everyone knew, said Miss Marple, her tone innocently bemused. Mr. Tulliver told me he spotted the stitching as soon as he saw the display, said it was clearly machine work. There was a silence, and then Mrs. Shipley spoke, far too quickly. Well, that explains why she didn't want it appraised last year. She must have known it was a fake. Miss Marple tilted her head. How curious. I hadn't realized you knew she declined an appraisal. Well, everyone assumed, Mrs. Shipley faltered, but Miss Marple wasn't listening to her words any more. She was watching her hands. They were clenched tightly around a spool of thread, and shaking. It was a sunny Saturday in St. Mary Mead, with just enough warmth to invite a light cardigan, and enough breeze to keep the laundry from clinging too hard to the lines. In Miss Marple's garden, birds chirped among the jasmine, and the roses nodded politely as if listening to the breeze. She had spent the morning preparing tea for a guest. Eleanor Shipley had been invited for a brief word, a phrasing that, coming from Miss Marple, could mean anything from checking a cake recipe to solving a murder. Mrs. Shipley arrived promptly, dressed impeccably in pale grey gloves and a hat trimmed with black grosgrain ribbon. Her handbag was the sort that snapped closed with an air of finality. "Jane," she said, with brittle cheer, "how lovely. You've been quite busy lately, haven't you? I hear you've spoken to Mr. Tulliver again." "Just a polite conversation," Miss Marple replied with a warm smile, handing her a cup of Darjeeling. "Do try the cherry sponge. It's my cleaner's recipe, surprisingly clever with almond." Eleanor bit daintily into a slice, but said nothing more. Miss Marple watched her, noting the tension in her jaw, the way she glanced not at the tea tray but toward the small glass-topped case beside the fireplace. Inside it, displayed on cream linen, lay a lace handkerchief. A new one. Not the original, of course, but very like its same size, same antique edging, same pale ivory tone that would pass for authentic unless studied carefully. Miss Marple gestured toward it. "I found it in a charity shop in Bexhill," she said lightly. "Imagine my surprise. They said a woman had donated it only a few weeks ago, described her as middle-aged, well-spoken, and very particular about folding things properly." Eleanor went still. "I was amazed at the resemblance," Miss Marple continued. "Of course, I'm no expert, but Mr. Tulliver says this one's quite genuine." The lie hung in the air like smoke. "I thought perhaps Lavinia's original had turned up after all," Miss Marple added, watching her guest closely. "But then, of course, I wondered, why would someone donate such a piece?" Mrs. Shipley set her cup down carefully, too carefully. "I expect they didn't know its value," she said stiffly. "Perhaps," Miss Marple smiled gently, "or perhaps they knew too much. You see, if someone were to plant a false handkerchief at a public fair, they'd need a reason, more than mere mischief. It would have to be personal, something long-standing." Ellie's eyes didn't meet hers. Or perhaps they wanted to discredit someone who had always seemed rather superior, someone who had belittled their opinions at every meeting, over every committee motion, her fingers working calmly. "Of course," she continued, "no one would do such a thing without a plan. First, replace the handkerchief. Then let it sit, unnoticed. Wait for the victim to show it off, to claim it publicly, and then, at the perfect moment, snatch it away. Declare it stolen. Let suspicion fall elsewhere." She looked up. "It's very neat," very tidy, almost like well-stitched hemwork, the kind of precision you pride yourself on, Eleanor. Mrs. Shipley stood abruptly. "I don't care for this conversation," she said, "and I don't care for accusations without proof." "There's no accusation," Miss Marple said mildly. "But it is curious, isn't it, that a near-exact copy of the original turns up just days after the supposed theft, complete with blue thread matching that found in your sewing basket. You've no right to go through my belongings." "I didn't," Miss Marple said, "but the Reverend's wife mentioned seeing it. I imagine she didn't realize what she'd seen until I asked." Mrs. Shipley turned toward the door. Miss Marple didn't stop her. She only added, gently, "You wanted to punish Lavinia, to make her admit her things weren't so precious after all. But when she didn't even notice the switch, when she doubled down and called it her heirloom, that must have stung." Mrs. Shipley's hand paused on the doorknob. "You made her look foolish," Miss Marple said, "but you also made yourself vulnerable, because you left behind threads, traces, and now, the truth." There was a beat of silence. Then Mrs. Shipley turned back. "She humiliated me for years," she said quietly, "over committee meetings, flower arrangements, the Jubilee program. Always correcting, always condescending." Her voice trembled. "I only wanted her to know what it felt like, to be undermined, discredited. I didn't mean for it to get so out of hand." Miss Marple nodded. "Resentment is a sharp needle. It can pierce deeper than anyone expects." Mrs. Shipley said nothing else. She opened the door and left without a goodbye. Miss Marple sat quietly for a while after, letting the silence fill the room. She looked at the imitation handkerchief in the case, and slowly folded it back into tissue. She would write to Evelyn Farnham tomorrow and tell her the truth, that her aunt's original piece had vanished long before the fair, that the scandal had been more about pride than theft, but it had ended more or less without violence. This time, by Monday afternoon, the scandal of the lace handkerchief affair, as the vicar's wife now referred to it, had begun to fade on the surface, at least. The scones at the tea shop were back to being the day's most pressing topic, and even Mr. Tulliver had resumed his usual sarcastic remarks about the village's taste in crockery. But Miss Marple knew better than to let a story end on a polite note. Truth, like embroidery, required the full pattern to be revealed. And so, she arranged for one final meeting. Lavinia Pinkerton was hesitant at first. Her pride remained bruised, and the questions surrounding the theft had only magnified her sense of exposure. But when Miss Marple mentioned tea and almond biscuits, and the possibility of some clarity, Lavinia reluctantly agreed. The vicar's sitting room was chosen for the occasion neutral ground, flanked by 2 china dogs and a large fern. Present were Miss Marple, Miss Pinkerton, Constable Derry, and Mrs. Elkins, who had brought her needlepoint to justify her presence. Mrs. Shipley had declined the invitation with a note citing a headache, which Miss Marple found unsurprising. Miss Marple began with no fanfare. "There has been quite a bit of speculation about your missing handkerchief, Lavinia, but I believe we now understand what truly occurred." Lavinia sat stiffly. "I never wanted all this attention." "I believe you," Miss Marple said, "but it came because of a misunderstanding, or rather, a series of them. The piece you displayed at the fair was not the original Antwerp handkerchief." Lavinia's lips thinned. "I know that now." "You suspected it, even then," Miss Marple said gently. "You mentioned the edging looked off. But pride is a powerful thing. You told yourself it was lighting, mounting anything but what it was." There was a pause. "I didn't want to believe someone had taken it," Lavinia said softly. "It was Rosalind's. The last thing she ever gave me." Miss Marple nodded. And I'm afraid someone did take it. Quietly, weeks before the fair, perhaps longer. The replacement was close enough to pass casual scrutiny. And when you placed it in the display, you may have done so without realizing it had already been swapped. Constable Derry cleared his throat. So, the theft at the fair wasn't a theft, said Miss Marple. At least, not then. Someone removed the false handkerchief, but only to create the illusion of a public crime. A scandal. They wanted to cast doubt on Miss Pinkerton's claims of authenticity. And they succeeded. Lavinia's eyes sharpened. But who would do such a thing? Miss Marple sipped her tea. There are many reasons why people hurt one another, but in this case, it wasn't about value. It was about dignity. Over the years, certain remarks, dismissals, corrections can become wounds. Mrs. Shipley, for example, has long felt overshadowed at the Women's Guild. She's precise, ambitious, and not immune to resentment. Mrs. Elkins stopped stitching. She always resented Lavinia's authority. She muttered. That Jubilee banner argument went on for weeks. Miss Marple continued. Mrs. Shipley had access to the guild storage. She brought the velvet lining for the display. She also had opportunity to access your home during committee visits. Most importantly, she admitted having a handkerchief of her owner, very similar, one wrapped in blue cloth, in her sewing basket. Constable Derry looked startled. She admitted that, not in so many words, Miss Marple replied. But she didn't deny it, and when I placed a nearly identical piece in my cabinet and said it had turned up in a charity shop, her reaction confirmed everything I needed. She panicked, Lavinia said, half to herself, because she realized the story had spiraled. Miss Marple said, and what began as a plan to humiliate you publicly, to challenge your reputations, suddenly risked revealing her own deceit. But the original handkerchief? Asked Constable Derry. Miss Marple shook her head. Still missing. I suspect it was sold. Quietly, possibly months ago. Perhaps to fund a small emergency. Perhaps even by mistake. I should have known, Lavinia whispered. When Evelyn asked so many questions, I thought it was just interest. But maybe it wasn't. I don't believe Evelyn took it, Miss Marple said, but I do think she recognized the copy. Her letter told me as much. It was her silence that allowed this all to go unnoticed. Lavinia was quiet for a long moment. Then she lifted her chin. I suppose I owe Mr. Tulliver an apology. Constable Derry looked vaguely relieved. I'll let him know we're dropping all suspicion. As for Mrs. Shipley, Lavinia paused. Will she be charged? Miss Marple smiled gently. I think humiliation will suffice. We all have reputations to protect, and with that, the tea was finished, the needlepoint folded away, and the meeting dispersed with murmured thanks. But Miss Marple lingered a moment longer, gazing at the fern by the window. Funny thing about lace, she said softly, so delicate, but stretch it just enough, and all the hidden flaws begin to show. Spring came in full flourish to Chipping Craden, as if eager to drape the village in fresh colors and brush away the remnants of scandal. The daffodils outside the vicarage bloomed with shameless optimism, and even the roses in Miss Pinkerton's garden, once left untended, had begun to open with renewed vigor. But despite the sunshine and the tidied hedgerows, the air still carried a faint residue of tension. As in all villages, the scandal had not vanished. It had simply been folded and tucked away, like the handkerchief itself, into the back of a drawer where it might be quietly revisited over tea. Mrs. Eleanor Shipley had taken to resting from guild duties. Though no formal apology was ever made, her absence from meetings was noted with the same unspoken understanding that passed between women who knew how to preserve dignity without exposing a wound. The lace display case at the village hall remained locked, and the word handkerchief was notably absent from most conversations. Miss Pinkerton resumed her routines with admirable poise, though her manner was more subdued. She did not mention the Antwerp piece again. In its place, she displayed a modest square of Irish crochet, dated 1875, accompanied by a label that simply read, "Gift from a dear friend." That friend, of course, was Miss Marple. It was a week later when Miss Marple sat with her knitting on the garden bench, the first cup of tea of the afternoon cooling beside her. The day was quiet, the air thick with the scent of jasmine and damp grass. She was not thinking about the case, not precisely. Rather, her mind was wandering, as it often did after such an affair, through the human complexities it had revealed. It had not been murder, nor even theft in the traditional sense, but it had been cruel in its own quiet way. Pride had been wounded, reputations had been threatened, and what made it so very interesting to Miss Marple was that it had all begun, not with greed, but with a needle and thread. Revenge, after all, did not always come with a dagger. Sometimes it arrived folded in tissue, wrapped in blue cloth, and presented with a smile. She thought of Mrs. Shipley not with malice, but with a curious, almost clinical compassion. The woman had been, at her core, lonely, desperate for recognition in a village that had long cast her as second best. Her plan had not been clever in the criminal sense, but it had been exact, personal, crafted with the same neatness she brought to her embroidery, and it had almost worked had Miss Marple not listened quite so closely, had Evelyn not written her quiet letter, had a child not remembered the difference between lace and linen. The truth might never have emerged. She picked up her teacup and sipped slowly. It was always the little things, she reflected. A word said too quickly, a glance held too long, a spool of thread left behind in a cupboard. Villages were built on such small details, and it was those details so ordinary, so invisible to most, that revealed what people truly were. The garden gate creaked, and the vicar's wife waved from the lane. "I've brought you a few fresh rolls, Jane," she called. "And there's talk of a summer fete. Without lace this time, I should think." Miss Marple chuckled softly. "Just as well. I believe the village has had quite enough drama sewn into its edges." They sat together in the soft warmth, speaking of weather and recipes, and who had painted their shutters the wrong color last week. And as they spoke, the world returned to its gentle, rhythmic hum. No grand pronouncements, no triumphant headlines, just the steady stitching of life in a village, where nothing and no one was ever quite what they seemed.